Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken, executive editor at the Mises Institute. And this week, we're going to talk a bit about housing and homelessness. And there's been quite a number of decent books coming out on this topic in recent years. And I want to talk about some of the scholarship related to homelessness, the issue of addressing it, what can be done, what causes it. Because I think if you've been following the national debate at all, you know that a lot of American cities have a homelessness problem. You see this, right? When you're getting on and off the freeway, there are people living in some of these quote-unquote public spaces, which are often just owned by the Department of Transportation or by some local government. And the tent cities, we hear about that. What's behind that? And on top of that, we've seen recent reports saying that homelessness has been increasing significantly for 2022 to 2023. Some reports tell us a 20% increase. And then on top of that, another 18% increase was a recent headline for 23-24 period. So there's clearly something going on there. And to talk about it, I've brought on Christopher Calton. Now, Chris Calton is a research fellow in housing and homelessness at the Independent Institute. He received his PhD in history at the University of Florida, where his research focused on the history of the corporation. I know him through the Mises Institute. I met him, 7, 8, 9 years ago, maybe, at least 5 or 6.
Before you had all that gray in your beard.
I was very young then at the time. And I knew Chris as a historian, which he is. But he's now got this great gig at the Independent Institute looking at housing and homelessness. And of course, there's a lot of historical issues behind that as well. So I'm happy to have him back on. He's done a lot of work for the Mises Institute in the past. He put together the Historical Controversies podcast, if you remember that one, and quite a number of articles as well for Mises Wire and Mises.org. So, Chris, welcome to Radio Rothbard. Let's talk about homelessness and what you've been reading on it recently. And I guess just to really address the issue of the headlines, the question is homelessness growing? And if so, I mean, kind of give us, and we'll go into more detail, but give us what you think are the basic rundown of why homelessness is growing. If it is. We can just kind of start out with, I think, just a general summary of, okay, homelessness is a thing. Is it getting bigger? And if so, why?
Well, the first question, the answer is simple. Yes, homelessness is growing, but I'll put this in a little bit more perspective because we usually get national figures. And national figures on homelessness can be very misleading because homelessness is a very local issue. It's usually a city issue. With places like California, it's statewide because they have a lot of big cities there, but homelessness is an urban issue. It tends to be very localized. And so the perspective that I like to bring people is until 2022, homelessness has been growing nationally for about almost a decade now. But if you take out California, homelessness in the rest of the United States was actually steadily declining until 2022. Since 2022, it has been going up nationally, even outside of California. There's still, in the most recent report, which just came out that revealed the 2024 point in time counts, which is the Housing and Urban Development, their method of counting homelessness. It's a notoriously inaccurate count, but it gives us a standardized way of comparing different states and different continuums of care that conduct these counts and handle homelessness services. And in the most recent numbers, homelessness nationally went up by 18%, but if you take out California and you look at the rest of the United States, it actually went up by something like 24%. I did the math on this last week, and I don't remember the exact number, but it was in the 20s. And so since 2022, homelessness outside of California has been going up like a hockey stick, right? It's like one of those hockey stick graphs. Slow decline until 2022, and then it's been shooting upward the past 2 years. Now, the proviso to this qualification is we don't really have 2021 numbers. They have them published, but they don't mean anything because COVID, we didn't have good homelessness counts. So it may have been going up since before then, which seems likely. But homelessness going up outside of California on the whole is a relatively recent phenomena. Homelessness in California has been steadily increasing by about 10,000 people a year since they made Housing First state policy in 2016. So they've been steadily declining for quite some time now. But outside of California, this is a more new and troubling trend. The one other thing I'll add is New York is the biggest culprit in this increase in homelessness outside of California. Just last year, they added over 50,000 new homeless people to its rolls. Since 2022, they've had, I think, 80-something thousand. It's nearly doubled in 2 years, New York's homeless population. So if you take New York out of the equation, the rest of the country is still going up, but New York is the biggest decider of the trajectory of that trend.
Well, when these are different sorts of places then, right? I mean, New York presumably has somewhat, I mean, maybe not totally, but somewhat different policies than California. And also homelessness is just generally we see going up in some of these more populous places, right? Like Texas, Florida to some extent as well. And certainly Texas policy is not identical to California policy.
Sure. Well, New York and California are going to be more comparable. California is the only state that has Housing First, which we can talk about it in a bit. I think you wanted to talk about Housing First a little bit. It's the only one that made Housing First state policy. It's been federal policy since 2013. But that doesn't necessarily mean that states have to abide by it when they're funding their own homelessness programs. California does. San Francisco's had it citywide since 2009, I think. So California is kind of a case study in Housing First failure. New York has not made Housing First state policy, but they may as well have. New York City, of course, is 99% of New York's homelessness, probably not quite that high, but close to it. And they're going to follow Housing First programs. The main difference in their policy is they have a right to shelter law, so their unsheltered homelessness in New York is actually quite low. Whereas in California, it's 66% of the homeless population is unsheltered. So that's a big difference between New York and California, but otherwise they're generally following a similar progressive playbook. Now, Texas and Florida, which are respectively the second and third largest states, New York is the fourth largest. So these are good states to compare. Texas and Florida did see increases in homelessness, but by much smaller margins. California added about 5,700 new homeless people. New York added about 54,000. Texas and Florida each added about 600 additional homeless persons. So it is a sign that things are getting worse because up until recently, homelessness was going down in these states, in most states. In the most recent report, only, I think, less than a half dozen states have declines in their homeless population. But Florida and Texas, compared to New York and California, good comparisons here, these are a good indicator of red state policies tend to be doing much better on homelessness than blue state policies. And I think that's a very important point.
Well, when we were talking about these sorts of things back in 2013, you mentioned the Housing First policy, which is just generally speaking this idea that when you have unhoused people, as the terminology goes, that the first step is to just get them in some sort of housing, and then you can address the underlying causes later with some sort of other policy. That was the discussion back when I was an economist for the State Division of Housing, which my job there was just to do research. So I didn't express opinions about policy or anything like that. But it was at that time that Hickenlooper was the governor, and I remember, or actually he was the mayor of Denver at the time, and I just remember him handing down this idea that he was going to have this 10-year plan to end homelessness. And of course, I mean, I don't know how anybody could take that seriously.
Denver is one of the worst cities in the country.
Right. I mean, well, of course, it was always going to be a joke, and then it's just been made far worse over the last decade or so. And so looking at that, right, obviously it didn't work, and they've been using a Housing First policy for quite some time. So looking at this, though, the Housing First idea tends to be based on certain conclusions and ideas about what causes homelessness. And there's been some books that have come out on this recently. You wrote a review of a couple of different books. One is called Homelessness as a Housing Problem by Colburn and Aldern. And then there's a book with different ideas called Homelessness in America by Stephen Ide. And so this presents some conflicting ideas on homelessness. This probably isn't like exhaustive of all the ideas about it, but where would you say we should come down on what the causes of homelessness are? Maybe we could just start by you noting what some of these competing ideas of what is behind homelessness, and that might help us kind of decide maybe what the solution should be.
Sure. Well, on one side, and this is reflected in the Housing First philosophy, as well as in the book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem. On the one side, you have people that kind of bring it down singularly to housing, right? Housing costs are higher. So homelessness is a housing problem. Very, very famous book now. It got a lot of buzz, a lot of attention. Their argument was if you look at, all of however many metropolitan areas they looked at, the strongest correlation with higher homelessness rates is higher housing and rental costs, which makes sense, obviously, on the margins, right? Economics on the margins, rent is higher, housing is higher. You're going to find more people displaced for their homes, and that's not wrong. The problem is treating that as a monocausal explanation, and this is what we get a lot of times from the Housing First crowd is you just got to get people housed, which I always kind of see as rigging the numbers. And the reason I see that is, Ryan, listeners probably don't. I went to my undergraduate and master's degree I got from Marshall University in West Virginia, Huntington, West Virginia, like the opioid capital of the world while I was there. Serious problem there. Homelessness is not a significant problem in West Virginia. Addiction and overdose is a very serious problem there. And so one of the reasons I push back against the housing only narrative is, in theory, of course, you can end homelessness by housing everybody. But if all you do is warehouse them, which is what's done under Housing First and permanent supportive housing, which means permanently subsidized housing, you warehouse them, well, that doesn't solve their other problems. And they've had studies. There was a study out of UPenn that studied permanent supportive housing in New York City. And they found that overdose mortality rates were actually higher in permanent supportive housing than they were among homeless people on the streets. You had more deaths from overdose. And there was another study, I can't remember where it was from, but found similar conclusions on this, where permanent supportive housing actually has higher overdose mortality rates than street homelessness. And part of that is because of the isolation you have, the privacy when you're using. Right, but if we're not solving these problems, what are we really doing? How much help are we really providing these people just by warehousing them and then waiting for them to die? And so that's kind of what I always think. The West Virginia perspective kind of does support the argument. Homelessness is a housing problem. It's tautologically a housing problem, right? We're defining it that way. But if we treat it only as that, how much help are we really giving people if we're leaving them in these horrible conditions and these addictions, mental illness, things like that, and we're not helping those things? So that's one side. And then the other side would point to things like mental illness and drug abuse. And what I think is important to point out, I wrote a Hill article about this, is these are two perspectives. You need both of them, because the people that say it's a housing problem, they're looking at the world like sociologists, right? Everybody is a collection of aggregates, and we need to study the aggregates. And homelessness is a housing problem. They're not looking at individuals, they're looking at cities. Whereas when you turn to the substance abuse equation, we're looking at it more the micro level, right? This is methodological individualism in the Misesian world. And we're thinking, what factors in an individual's life makes them statistically more likely to fall into homelessness? And we find that overwhelmingly at substance abuse and mental illness. And an important caveat to that is when we talk about homelessness, these homelessness numbers, like in the point in time counts, what they're counting are people who just pass through the system. And the majority of people who are homeless temporarily. They pass through the systems, they make use of these services, they get back on their feet, whatever they need, and it's short-lived. But there's there's two categories, unsheltered homeless and chronic homeless. And it's not that these are perfectly overlapping categories, but they're heavily overlapping categories. Unsheltered and chronic overlap almost entirely. They both constitute roughly about a third of the homeless population, and they correspond heavily with the percentage of the homeless population that suffers from at least one of a substance abuse or mental illness, right? So then you have three categories there that are heavily overlapping. Well, why does that matter? If you talk to some people on the housing side, they say, well, that's a minority of the homeless population. And it is, but it's a significant, a third is a significant minority. You can't just dismiss that. That's a lot. And this is the homeless population that we see when we visit San Francisco and we drive through the Tenderloin district, when we go to Portland, we drive through downtown, right? What we're seeing is this category of homelessness. It's only a third of the homeless population that we count in January when we conduct these counts, but it's the third that stays homeless, that it's in the worst condition, that has the widest effect on the community around them, right? It's that homeless population that housing alone is not going to solve. In fact, many people in this actually decline offers for housing in most cases because they don't want to be too far from their drug dealer. Nels Anderson, a formerly homeless sociologist at the University of Columbia in the early 20th century, he was the leading expert on homelessness at the time. He wrote a book on it, and he said as much. He said, the cocaine addict and the alcoholic can be away, they can go for long periods without their drugs. But he said the reason the heroin addicts live outdoors, when back then homelessness just meant you lived in a hotel, but the reason the heroin addicts lived outdoors is because they couldn't be away from their dealer that long. He wrote this in the 1920s, right? And so this still holds true. So housing is not going to solve the problem for that population. And just because it's a minority of the homeless population, it is the one that is most visible, in the worst condition, and has the greatest effect on the community around them.
Right. You can see, of course, that the cost of housing is going to have some effect on homelessness, right? Especially for those who are temporarily homeless, right? It's hard to come up with that money for that security deposit and that sort of thing. So that's going to cause at least some temporary homelessness. But of course, at the same time, you can't attribute it all to mental illness too, right? If homelessness was all due to mental illness and you have an 18% increase in homelessness, that's a big problem. If mental illness went up 18%, well, that's an entirely different problem and maybe something indicative of something even far worse. So yeah, I completely agree. We don't want it. We can't really attribute this to any one thing, depending on, right? Are we talking about someone who's been on the street for 10 years or someone who's been on the street for 30 days? Completely different situation.
Right. The problem with the homelessness as a housing problem argument isn't that housing isn't a significant factor. It's that they're treating housing as a monocausal explanation for homelessness, and that's the problem. It's not monocausal.
Right. I mean, like so many problems, there are different causes for different people. And so it would seem that there should be a variety of different issues that need to be addressed. However, the issue of its housing being or homelessness being a housing problem, what do you say to the issue of, okay, well, then we need to produce more housing? Does that address the issue? It would seem that would not address the issue of the heroin addict who lives on the street because they're not likely to get a job that's going to pay a significant monthly rental charge, apparently even in the 20s, right? For those of us who read books about local government, homelessness, and that sort of thing, right? We know that 100 years ago, there were people who now live on the street who would have lived in what we called flop houses back then, right? And a lot of those were just destroyed and abolished by urban renewal and that sort of thing. So that's certainly a contributing factor. But just building more housing isn't going to solve that problem. Nevertheless, though, why couldn't we address some of the homelessness problem by producing more housing at lower price points? Wouldn't that help? And if so, how much would it help?
Yeah, well, I think hard to quantify how much it would help, but it would absolutely help, right? Again, on the margins, housing costs are going to move the needle on homelessness. And most significantly, what it's going to do is it's going to reduce the number of people that are passing briefly through the system. And that's important as well, because those people are using resources through these services that could otherwise go to somebody else, right? These resources are strained when homelessness keeps ballooning the way that it has been. So it would certainly help. I mean, housing is an important part of the problem. I don't want to reduce it all to housing like some people do, but it's an important component in the homelessness problem. And it's going to primarily help those people that pass temporarily through the system by preventing them from falling temporarily into homelessness, right? When they lose their apartment or something like this, they can't make rent. So it is going to help people. It is going to reduce those numbers, and that's important because that leaves more resources available to help everybody else that maybe needs a little bit more help. So housing, I think, more housing is probably the number one thing that does need to happen. You just can't expect, if you build enough housing to house all the homeless people, you can't expect that to solve the problems of the people that are suffering from heroin addiction, fentanyl addiction, the people that are suffering from severe schizophrenia, right? They need help beyond just the home that you might provide them.
Now, is that part of the housing first plan? I mean, so when you have people who are saying we need just to get people in more housing, do any of these people put any stock at all in the idea of having more private sector production of housing and deregulating and paving the way for just more housing production overall, or they just think totally in terms of subsidized housing?
Almost totally in terms of subsidized housing. That was one of my big critiques of housing. Homelessness as a housing problem is they concluded the book by talking about the need for government subsidized housing. Now, they did advocate mixed market. They didn't call for a nationalized housing industry or anything like that, but they wanted more government intervention, more government subsidies in the housing market to try to provide that. And one of the things I pointed out too is if you looked at if you did the same way they approached the homelessness problem with the housing problem, which is we're going to look at cities and see what correlates with the highest or lowest housing rates, you're going to find that cities that leave housing more to the market and less to the government have cheaper and more available housing, places like Houston, right? States like Texas and Florida. So had they just used their same methodology that they did to determine that homelessness was a housing problem, to decide whether or not we need more private housing or privately built housing or more subsidized housing, then the conclusion obviously would have been you need to leave it more to the market, right? And that's one of the things that drove me crazy is like clearly they're governed by some ideological bias there that they can't even turn the same way of looking at the problem on how we produce housing.
Well, I remember that part of the reason they didn't like that was they didn't like the idea of just producing more private sector housing was that due to regulation and the need to all the underlying fixed costs of financing, of getting permits, all of that stuff, it meant that new production of housing was generally going to cater to a higher end level of rent, right? A higher price point, as they would say. So that if you're going to make new housing, it had to command a certain minimum rent. But they would deny that just creating more housing overall would just make housing more affordable, right? Because if you just put you're in a town and you add another 1,000 units, right? Your people who have the higher incomes are going to move into those units, and then they're going to leave the cheaper units behind. And those cheaper units are going to be more affordable then, because now you have not 1,000 new tenants, but you have 1,000 new units. So of course that's going to leave some units empty, and you're going to have to reduce then asking rents on those units, and that's going to make it more affordable, especially to these people who aren't your lowest of the low in terms of income people, but they could prevent homelessness for some people. But I've found, like you, that in talking to people who think about homelessness a lot, that's just not even something that they think is even a real option. They don't seem to put any stock in the idea that if you have a certain population and you increase the supply of housing, that's going to reduce the overall price of housing. They don't even think that's a real thing, right? These are the sorts of people who think that economics is like a political ideology invented by capitalists to justify their nefarious profit seeking and that sort of thing. So bizarrely, you've got all of these housing activists who don't even want to produce more housing unless it's subsidized and open only to low-income people. And of course, the market has very little incentive to produce that sort of housing. So the whole activist mindset just doesn't seem to be interested at all in working with the private marketplace, even though historically it would seem that that's the way you produce housing stock, right? Especially since housing stock doesn't just, it lasts, it's built to last for at least 55 years in most cases. But the older it gets, the cheaper it gets, too, is how it works. And that's why when you are young, you're living in a 50-year-old apartment building in many cases. That's what's affordable. However, when it was first built, that apartment building perhaps catered to higher income, fashionable people, but that was a long time ago. And now you're living there for $900 a month in some cases, and it seems like a dump now. But you're benefiting from luxury apartments that were built decades ago, and it just seems that a lot of the housing activists don't seem to think through that issue at all.
Yeah, well, I mean, and one thing I'll say is if we're talking about people like the authors of Homelessness as a Housing Problem, I don't think that they would deny that building more housing in the private sector would lower housing prices. I think they understand that. What they don't believe is that the private sector can adequately meet the supply, and this seems more true when you look at places like California. And the problem is not that they deny that more housing in the private sector would lower prices. The problem is that they don't understand that like, how do you facilitate the private sector building more houses? And when you have all these high regulations, what it does is it raises the fixed cost of building housing. The cost of building an affordable apartment unit, an affordable, like as in a subsidized one, apartment unit in California can reach like near $1 million. I was looking at one just the other day for something I was writing, a report I'm working on, where it was like a 49 unit apartment complex, and the per unit, and these were affordable housing. This was supportive housing for formerly homeless people, mentally ill veterans. Like, this is who it was for. These were cheap, bare bones apartments, and the per unit cost was over $700,000. That's because of regulation out the wazoo in California. They over-regulated to the point where the only thing that it's profitable to build at market rates would be luxury, high-income housing. There's no market for like affordable housing in Houston. Doesn't mean subsidized housing. It just means cheap rent, right? But in California, affordable housing means subsidized housing because you can't profitably make housing that you charge these low rents, because the below market rate rents are below the market rate that is inflated by all these regulations, right? And so you can have private sector, you can leave housing to the market, but the way a lot of Californians think is leaving it to the market means leaving all the regulations in place, leaving all of the other policies in place that go into this, and just not subsidizing it at all. And that's not what it means. It means you got to deregulate. You got to actually let the market work. Like Houston's the example because they don't have any zoning regulations. Housing is remarkably cheap in Houston, the 5th largest city in the country. Median home is like $330,000 or something like that, compared to like San Jose, where it's over $1 million in California, right? I mean, it's a ridiculous difference that we can see just based on the level of regulation that you have in the housing market in different cities. So leaving it at the market doesn't mean going into California and maintaining the status quo. It means they need to deregulate heavily, and then the private market can do it. But because they're regulating so much, they have to use taxpayer subsidies to produce these affordable housing, because there's no way to make them profitably without subsidies under all of this red tape that they have to wade through that adds so much to the cost of building housing. Now, that being said, among activists, you're right. There are people, there've been polls on this where in NIMBYism, not in my backyard, activists who block housing development, among like wealthy suburban NIMBYs, they want to block housing construction because this is called the home voter hypothesis, because at its core, they understand that it's going to prop up the cost of housing, which means preserving and raising the value of their home that they own. But among like lower income people in apartment complexes, they actually overwhelmingly support blocking housing construction. There's a lot of NIMBYism there as well, but it's because they believe that building new housing is going to raise the cost of their rent. This is the myth of gentrification. Like the people believe that gentrification raises like rental costs. It actually doesn't. There's studies that show that it does not. Right, but this is what a lot of people believe, and so there are a lot of people who do oppose new housing because somehow they just don't have such a a non-existent understanding of economics that they think that more housing is going to raise their rent for some reason. But what's really important to understand, especially in places like the West Coast, where you have a lot of laws that focus on affordable housing. We need housing at below market rates, and so they offer subsidies or certain kind of regulatory breaks or things like that for developers who build an apartment complex that reserves some units for like a certain percentage of the median income, or where it's below market rent. And they try to have all these incentives to build housing, but what they don't understand is that, and there's study after study that confirms this, is when you build housing at any income level, it lowers the cost of housing at every income level, right? You build luxury housing, people are going to move into that, they're going to create vacancies everywhere, and everybody's going to move up a rung. And so it creates lower rents and lower housing costs at every income level, no matter what income level the housing is built for.
So with so little interest in deregulation or actual market solutions, what are the solutions to homelessness being offered by people like Gavin Newsom? I mean, they talk about homelessness a lot and say they're going to solve the problem. How come it never seems to work? I mean, what are the ideas they're putting forward?
So as I mentioned earlier, California is like a case study in the failure of housing first. So this is what we want to talk about, I think, to understand that question is, what is housing first? Housing first is at its simplest level. Housing first is the philosophy that all we need to do to solve homelessness is get people housed, get them housed immediately, and keep them housed, right? And when you put it like that, well, that's obviously true. Again, it's like pedantic. Of course that's true, even if it's just rigging the numbers. If they're still hooked on fentanyl or suffering from schizophrenia and have all these other problems, they're not homeless if they're in a house, right? And people who are placed in permanent supportive housing under Housing First, they're not counted as homelessness. Now, there's subsidies that support them for the rest of their lives as permanent wards of the state, essentially. Those come from homelessness budgets, but they're not counted as homeless. I would actually like to find, I was thinking about this just the other day, I don't know if these statistics exist, but if you could find how many people are in permanent supportive housing in different states, if you were to add that to the homeless numbers, how would it change things? Because they're not counted as homelessness, but they are drawing from homelessness resources for the duration of really their life. Because again, it's permanent supportive housing. But the problem with this philosophy is a few problems with the philosophy, but the main one to me is that it treats every homeless person as a lost cause. There is no consideration of the possibility that people that are currently homeless could become independent and self-sustaining, right? And this is a huge problem. The original study on Housing First, the experiment in New York by a guy named Sam Timbris, if I'm pronouncing his last name right, he was looking at mentally ill homeless clients. That's specifically what he was looking at. And he was comparing it to the prevailing system of, under the Clinton continuum of care system, which was more of like a staircase model. You had to work your way up to housing by going through treatment programs, getting treatment for mental illness, whatever, work training programs, different things, and you could work your way up into housing. And what he found in that study was something like 56 or 46%, I think, around there, 40-something percent of the people who went through traditional programs were able to become independent and self-sustaining. And so what he framed his question as is, okay, if we have these permanent, no questions asked subsidies, which is to say you don't have to have sobriety, you can't have sobriety requirements or anything like that. So you can be on drugs, you can be addicted, you can use them in these houses and they can't evict you for them. So he said, if you have no questions asked housing that's permanently subsidized, do people stay housed longer? And he's found about 80% of people stayed housed under these programs. And that seems significant, but that's a different framing than 46% of people under the old programs became independent and self-sustaining. They were no longer having to take these resources, and they were living fuller, richer, healthier lives. So which program is really better? The one that keeps people housed more, but doesn't help them with their addiction and lets them die of fentanyl overdoses in their supportive housing units, or the one that actually helps them get on their feet and be self-sustaining? And I would say the latter is probably better. And the problem with, okay, 80% of the people stay housed, that's people who go through the program. But the problem is, especially in places like California, you don't have the housing, right? So they need the housing because their entire homelessness program revolves around getting people housed, and then they can't build housing in the state. Right, so this is just completely conflicting with their own homelessness policy. They have nowhere to put these people. So yes, the people get placed in permanent supportive housing, may stay housed longer, but you have 66% of the homeless population living unsheltered, the largest homeless population in the country, because you don't have housing for them, and that's your only solution. That's your only strategy for ending homelessness. It makes no sense. It's a clown world. But there are other problems with Housing First that are worth mentioning. And why I think this bodes really poorly for California and other places like Portland is there's one of the mandates under Housing First is that outreach workers have to prioritize the most desperate cases. Now that sounds perfectly reasonable on the surface, but in practice it's horrible. So what they'll do is outreach workers will actually find people living on the streets and they'll give them vulnerability assessment tests. And if they don't score low enough or high enough on those vulnerability assessment tests, they're not offered housing. And so what this means is that people that might be able to quickly escape homelessness have to actually wait until their conditions degrade further until they're given any help. There was a heartbreaking case I saw. It was a guy in Portland who just documents, he interviews homeless people on the street, and it was just somebody he interviewed. But it was a woman who was denied housing living on the streets until she lost both her legs to frostbite. And once she became a double amputee, then she was given housing. And that's built in to the policy of Housing First, is you have to prioritize the most desperate people, which means neglecting people that want and need help immediately and are willing to take it until their condition deteriorates to the point of no return. And that's exactly what this is. This woman is going to be a ward of the state for the rest of her life, and maybe that wasn't inevitable had she received help to begin with, but she didn't score high enough on these vulnerability assessment tests until she lost both her legs to frostbite. And that's just heartbreaking. It's tragic. It's inhumane. And then finally, the last problem with Housing First is, in theory, you do have support for things like mental illness and substance abuse. It just can't be mandatory as a condition for being placed into housing. That's the rule in Housing First. But in practice, this is often neglected entirely. Under California's state law, under one of the tenets of Housing First is harm reduction, which is kind of an amorphous term. It's one of those things that might mean things that we support, and it might mean things that we oppose, in terms of how we approach drug use, like carrying Narcan around would be harm reduction that a lot of anti-harm reduction people would agree with. But in California, this is written into the law, and this is it goes further than the federal law for harm reduction under Housing First. Because in California, you can't stigmatize addiction at all. And what this translates to is even offering somebody a treatment program or even suggesting to them that they enter into rehab would be stigmatizing. And so you can't do this. And so instead you get these posters in San Francisco that have a picture of happy people. I'm kid you not, this is a real poster in San Francisco that has a picture of smiling people shooting up heroin and says, make sure you don't use alone, stay safe, or something like that, right? This is an actual dystopian picture in San Francisco because it's stigmatizing to even encourage people to get into rehab, right? And so this is a major problem because even if we're housing these people, more than half of homeless overdose deaths are taking place in permanent supportive housing. According to these studies that I mentioned earlier, more than half of overdose deaths among the homeless population are in permanent supportive housing units. This is a big issue. They're not helping them in California. Now, if you're outside of California and you're a Housing First program under federal law, you can still offer like treatment programs. It's not the cornerstone. It's not where the lion's share of the grant money goes to or anything, but you can still do this. So sometimes people will list things like Houston as a Housing First success, where Houston was very successful in lowering their homeless rates. But again, Houston has very cheap housing. It's very easy to build housing there. And so their resources aren't completely tied up just trying to get people into housing that doesn't exist in sufficient quantities to meet the needs, right? And so they're in Texas, where there is more of a culture around recovery and rehab rather than harm reduction and enabling or whatever. And so they do actually tend to fund these programs under Housing First grants more than many other places, more than California is even allowed to. California cities, if they take state money, they're not even allowed to do that, essentially because of the harm reduction policy, the way it's interpreted there.
Well, I know that what a lot of people who think about the homelessness issue, when they do think about it, a lot of it is because they're seeing images of tent cities or streets lined with homeless encampments. And there's been a lot of debate in the last 5, 6, 7 years about, okay, what do we do with these encampments? And it seems that there's a big issue of, okay, can we at least just get these people not living on my front yard? And of course, there's been a lot of policy stuff going on with that, right? Like Denver had a camping ban, which said, no, you can't camp in the park, and you can't camp on the Hell Strip right in front of those grassy strips between the sidewalk and the street, where a lot of tents end up. You can't live there. But then federal court handed down this decision saying, oh, well, you can't clean up these homeless encampments or move these homeless people without jumping through a bunch of hoops first. You've got to give them 10 days notice, and you've got to have some sort of shelter unit available for them somewhere. And so what this really helped then these encampments proliferate. So I think the question a lot of people would ask is, okay, so these people, they're refusing help. They don't want to live in a shelter. And if the shelters aren't working, do we just let these people live wherever they want in the city, scattered throughout the city? Isn't that dangerous? Isn't that a health issue? I mean, what is to be done about encampments then? And does that actually contribute to an issue in terms of solving homelessness, or is it really just a matter of moving people around?
Sure. So some background for this, because this was big news a few months ago, is up until I think in June of last year, 2024, there was a ruling. I don't remember the ruling, but it was a few years back that basically said, the Supreme Court said, you can't, or a district court or something, I don't remember the details, but they said you can't ban homeless encampments unless you have adequate shelter to provide the people living there, which again sounds reasonable enough, but in practice, this was sufficiently vague that homelessness advocates who think that any kind of ban on encampment is criminalizing homelessness or any of this, it is very easy for them to contest any attempts to remove a homeless encampment, right? Because what does adequate shelter consist of, right? And it could be these absurd things. You have to have private bathrooms, or, I mean, what does adequate shelter consist of? And it's so open-ended that you can't define it well enough to qualify under the law. And so they finally overturned this grants pass decision, is what it was called. They overturned this in June of 2024. And so cities now have the power again to clear out their homeless encampments. Gavin Newsom has been applauding himself for all the homeless encampments that California clears, which is laughable because it's basically just whack-a-mole there. And this is kind of the problem. I support the overturning the grants pass decision. I don't think people have an inherent right to these public spaces, and you ought to be able to do something about them. But in California, they don't have anywhere for them to go, so they just clear them out of one area and they just pop up somewhere else. It's just whack-a-mole, right? And so Gavin Newsom, last year we cleared 300 encampments. You're clearing the same encampments 20 times, because they're just popping up elsewhere. Because you don't have a place for them. But most cities outside of California do have shelters have vacancy rates very frequently that are high because of things like sobriety requirements. And so most cities do have places for them to go, and the people in these encampments just choose not to, sometimes for good reasons. Congregate shelters can be problematic. There's a lot of, they're not well monitored, well maintained, so there can be a lot of bad behavior that goes on there. But a lot of people will choose to stay on them. But it goes back to that question of what about the rights of people outside of these encampments that are affected by them? And those rights matter too. But you're not allowed to talk about that in the homelessness debate. Is the rights of the people that are negatively affected by these homeless encampments? So I think it's good that cities are allowed to clear out homeless encampments now. But it's a pointless ruling in California because it's just something that Newsom and other politicians are doing to make headlines. But it's not reducing the homeless population. It's not helping anybody there.
Well, won't a lot of people just say then, I'd rather just live somewhere that they're right. I just want to live in a town where they're just going to make it unhospitable to homeless people, right? Because isn't that part of the argument also is that if you have some sort of housing first program or you have some sort of program where you offer a lot of services to very low income people who are likely to be homeless, that locality then is going to attract a lot of homeless people. So if you're a heroin addict, you're like, hey, I don't mind living on the street, but I'd rather live on the street where the weather's nice or in some place where they're going to give me free stuff all the time. Right? What do we say to those people, right? I mean, it seems like it's got to be true at least sometimes.
Yeah, San Francisco and Portland are great examples of this. They're magnets for homeless drug addicts and homeless drug dealers. Because of their decriminalization policies, which California just finally overturned. Their decriminalization of drugs was paired with a law that decriminalized theft up to like $950. They finally kind of overturned that just in the recent election. They arrested some shoplifters recently who were like, this is a felony now? It's like when they were arrested. So that's a recent change, but these decriminalization policies, and I like to point this out because a lot of libertarians like decriminalization. As you know, I think decriminalization is a red herring for libertarians. Legalization is a different thing than decriminalization, and we shouldn't confuse the two. But under these decriminalization policies, you do have homeless drug users and homeless drug addicts kind of flocking to these cities like Portland and San Francisco. And you'll find this will be another thing that a lot of homeless advocates in the housing first world will deny this. They say, no, most of them are local. And then you look at these studies and it's like, there was one out of California a year or so ago that was like, oh, most people are from the area. And it's like, okay, they're in San Francisco and like 60% are from somewhere else in California. It's like, so it's not really local. California is a pretty big state, right? So people are absolutely migrating to these cities. The exact proportions are really hard to get at, but that it's happening is 100% true. And so it does matter. That is going to draw people. Good weather tends to correlate not with necessarily more homelessness, but with more unsheltered homelessness. Unsheltered homelessness is higher predominantly in the southern states because the weather's warmer. It's concerningly high in the West Coast in the north, because the good weather can't explain it there, but I think that's just a statement of how bad the policies are. But generally, outside of the northwest coast, unsheltered homelessness tends to be high in the southern states compared to the rest of the country, but not necessarily higher homelessness overall.
In terms of the statistics, though, wouldn't that tend to then make homelessness look worse in warmer places because then you just have more unsheltered people? So, and I could be just getting this wrong then, but if you're in a warm climate, there's going to be more people more comfortable with living outside. So aren't there then going to be higher numbers in the point in time surveys than in those cases? So Florida is just going to naturally seem like it has more homeless because it's just going to have more people out on the street rather than in shelters, or maybe I'm wrong about that.
So the percentage of the homeless population that lives unsheltered is higher in more temperate climates. That pattern is very clear, but this does not correlate with higher overall homelessness rates. I mean, the South in general, where you have that, typically, like most southern states have pretty low rates of homelessness. Texas and Florida have low rates. Per capita homelessness in these states is quite low. In absolute numbers, it's high because they're big states, but in per capita rates, it's quite low. Other southern states, very low as well. And Part of that's because in the South you have more market-oriented policies and you can build housing, and they believe in treating drug addiction. There's things beyond the weather there at play. But overall homelessness does not correlate with more temperate climates. Unsheltered homeless does, and so a higher percentage of the total homeless population is homeless in those areas. But compared to like New York is 91% sheltered homelessness, but it has 150,000 homeless people, right? Texas has a significantly lower number of homeless people, but it's like 44% unsheltered, right? And so that's the difference. Much lower rates of homelessness there, not because of the good weather, but the good weather doesn't correlate to just overall increases in homelessness, just the proportion that's unsheltered, which can make it seem worse because, again, it's the unsheltered population that people interact with when they're visiting these cities. So it can make it seem worse, but if we're just doing it as a percentage of the total population, 44% in Texas is a much smaller number than the 66% in California, not just because it's a lower percentage, but because it's a percentage of a lower total population.
Well, and then just to wrap up then with, you just touched on it a minute ago, but to emphasize then, what would you say then is the reason why there's less homelessness proportionally in some of these places? So, you say that, yes, a lot of these southern states, they tend to have less homelessness, and part of that is it's cheaper to produce housing. Maybe they're actually treating drug addiction. So what are these places doing right where there are lower rates of proportional homelessness?
Well, I think those are the two things. Housing is easier to build, right? If housing is easier to build, it's cheaper. If it's cheaper, then on the margins, you're going to have lower rates of homelessness for the reasons we talked about earlier, right? The housing is homelessness is a housing problem thesis isn't wrong in that respect. Where you have cheaper housing, you are going to have lower rates of homelessness. That's absolutely true. So if you look at Texas, then that seems to fit, right? Texas has cheaper housing, very cheap housing, nationally speaking, and they have per capita rates of homelessness are rather low in Texas. But on the other hand, what you also find in Texas is that their rates of overdose and overdose mortality are lower than the national average, right? And so that also speaks to the other side of the equation, which is they believe in treatment. They believe in treatment for drug addiction. They believe in treatment for mental illness, right? And that makes a difference as well. So how much that affects the actual homelessness counts. Again, you can end homelessness technically by housing everybody, but that doesn't solve all the problems associated with homelessness. Texas does better on problems associated with homelessness that can't be solved with housing, like overdose mortality. So I think it speaks to both problems. It's cheaper to build housing, and it's easier to build housing, and you have emphasis on drug treatment and recovery.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap up with that then for this episode of Radio Rothbard. Thank you, Christopher Calton from the Independent Institute, coming on to this week. And I think we'll, in the future, come back to this issue, because I think housing is going to be a significant issue, not just homelessness, but other issues related to housing, first-time home buyers.
Housing is an issue beyond homelessness for people like in my generation. I'm a millennial, Gen Z. Like, housing is increasingly out of reach in many areas of the country. And housing is going to be a bigger political issue because it has a wider effect. It's touching more people's lives, not just the homeless, but people that would like to own a home, that would like to own a bigger home for their family. So housing is going to be a growing issue if it doesn't get better.
Yes, knowing people in their 20s now, this is not an ideal situation for being a first-time home buyer. So, the whole ladder, up and down. I think we see an increasing issue here in terms of housing issues. And that's related to also monetary issues as well, which I think we can get to discussing in the future also. So thanks, Chris, for joining us today on this episode. And thank you all out there for listening. We'll be back next week with more, and we'll see you next time. Hello, Radio Rothbard listeners. Before you go, I just wanted to mention our upcoming event in Tampa, Florida. That is the Educating for Liberty Mises Circle, and that's coming up February 22nd. That's going to cover a big chunk of the day, and we're going to have a variety of great guests for that. We've got Tom DiLorenzo, of course, the president here at the Mises Institute. Also, some of our top economists, Timothy Terrell and Jonathan Newman. And we've also got Jason Jewell, who, by the way, has recently been appointed as the Chief Academic Officer for the Florida University system here for this year and moving forward. So a good slate of guests. We're going to be talking about how to educate yourself and others on the issue of freedom and liberty. So if you're in the region, consider joining us for that. You can sign up for that by going to the Mises Institute's website and clicking on events. That's mises.org, and just click on events. Hope to see you there.